One of America's leading authorities on sexual addiction is about to shine a light into the darkness of porn addiction. The bright side of addiction is recovery. If you're in recovery or know or love someone who is, or maybe you simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know or love, well, this is the podcast for you, as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder that you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And another reminder, September is National Recovery Month. You can find out what events are happening in your community by going to nationalrecoverymonth.org. They do this every September around the country, and this year's theme is Recovery is for Everyone, every person, every family, every community. And as I always say, recovery is living proof. While we usually focus on addiction recovery from alcohol and drugs, today we're going to talk about what is one of the most secretive and destructive addictions, sex addiction, and recovery, on this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast. We are fortunate to have with us one of America's leading authorities on sex addiction. He's Dr. Rob Weiss. He's been helping sex addicts find healing and recovery for well over 30 years. He is highly skilled and highly trained in this area. He's compassionate, empathetic, and he puts a focus on recovery. He'll be the keynote speaker at the 48th Annual Conference of TAP, the Texas Association of Addiction Professionals. And here's a quick clip from today's interview.
At the treatment center, right now I have a man who is a neurosurgeon, and I've got a guy sitting next to him who is a priest, and then next to him I've got a guy who, basically does street cleaning. And it doesn't matter, I look at these men like you do in meetings, and what they have in common is the alienation, the isolation, the shame about the sexual behavior, the people they're harming, the loss of connection and family. That's how addicts come together. It's one of the few things that people really join together around the problem. And when you get to the problem, like you and I know, nothing else matters. There are no barriers between where you come from. There's no class. There's no race. There is, we want to heal, and we will heal together. And so I see that all the time, and it always fascinates me that men of such diverse backgrounds come together and they say, "You're just like me."
I believe you will find this interview absolutely fascinating and perhaps healing as well. And we will close out this podcast with some reflections on people, places, and things from legendary actor and a man in long-term recovery, Dick Van Dyke. Recovery is as recovery does. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast. Our website again, recoverycoasttocoast.org. That's recoverycoasttocoast.org. You will find all of our podcasts there. Following 15 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, we have now upgraded to a national podcast available to anyone at any time, featuring interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians, authors, and recovering celebrities, and newsmakers as well, people who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast, share it with your friends as well. Recovery is an American way of life. And a reminder that our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. We would love to hear from you. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest and least expensive and most successful treatment programs. Now, people often ask me why I endorse them and talk about them on the podcast all the time. Well, that's an easy one. It's because I've personally sent many patients to Sundown. I know their treatment works. I know because I have seen it over and over again. It's worked well for over 50 years. And there's a whole ton of reasons why, but the most important one is their staff, which is a veteran staff. They've been there a long time. Sundown pays them well, treats them well, and they love helping people find the path to long-term recovery. There are a lot of fancy places around, a lot of treatment centers. Some have swimming pools and golf courses. and all the upscale amenities that you can think of. But believe me, a treatment center is more than its pretty building and fancy advertising. Sundown is a not for profit, 12 step centered residential program. Located outside of Seattle at the mouth of the Yakima River Canyon in Yakima, Washington, they own their own land, and that contributes significantly to lowering their cost for treatment. They also don't just treat and release. After residential treatment, they make sure that you have the building blocks in place in your community to support long term recovery. They have a continuing care program that keeps individuals and families engaged. And they also have a gender specific program for adolescents, which is, gosh, second to none. They accept major insurance and they can help you if finances are an issue. Now, if you have a few minutes, I invite you to check out their website. It's a pretty good one, sundown.org. Sundown M Ranch, it's where recovery becomes reality. Sexual addiction is often snickered about, laughed about. I've heard a number of men say, gee, that's an addiction I would love to have. Well, think again, pal. It's a devastating, highly secretive, and tremendously stigma laden disease that ruins numerous lives, not just the sex addict, but family members, friends, relationships, lives. Porn addiction is a part of that, and it feeds on isolation and secrecy. The 48th Annual Conference of the Texas Association of Addiction Professionals will hold their annual conference down in San Antonio in a couple of weeks, and it'll feature a keynote address from one of America's leading experts on sex and porn addiction. He's Dr. Rob Weiss. Dr. Rob is also Chief Clinical Officer of Seeking Integrity. That's a treatment program located in Southern California. And Dr. Rob is on a mission to change our thinking on codependence, a paradigm shift to be sure. He wants to focus on pro-dependence, saluting and honoring those who surround the addict on their path to recovery. He's going to talk in great detail about that in his keynote address down in Texas. But today, I want to focus on recovery from sex and porn addiction. Is there treatment available? What does that treatment look like? How is it similar to or different from other kinds of treatment and recovery? I recently caught up with Dr. Rob, and let's listen to that conversation. A former U.S. Supreme Court justice once famously said, I'm not sure what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. The Oxford Dictionary defines pornography as printed or visual material containing the explicit description or display of sexual organs or activity intended to stimulate erotic rather than aesthetic or emotional feelings. Is it a standalone addiction? Is it a subset of sexual addiction? Now, many leading psychologists and psychiatrists believe that it is. And according to one definition, porn addiction refers to a person becoming emotionally dependent on pornography to the point that it interferes with their daily life, relationships, and ability to function. In this segment of the program, we're joined by one of America's leading authorities on sexual addiction, Dr. Rob Weiss, who is the Chief Clinical Officer of Seeking Integrity. Their website is seekingintegrity.com, where you'll find an incredible amount of information about sex addiction, porn addiction, co-occurring and drug issues, and pro-dependence. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I love their mission statement, which for me is highlighted by, at Seeking Integrity, we believe very strongly that building and maintaining a supportive community of recovery, both online and in the real world, is a key to long-term healing. Recovery is as recovery does. Dr. Rob, again, Clinical Officer of Seeking Integrity. It's an online and residential intimacy disorders program in Southern California. We'll find out more about that as well. And Dr. Rob is an author, international educator, and clinical expert in treatment of adult intimacy disorders and related addiction. Boy, he's got a ton of books out, too, including Pro-Dependence, The End of Codependency, and I definitely want to get into that. It's a great topic. Cruise Control, Understanding Sex Addiction in Gay Men, Sex Addiction 101, Cyber Sex Exposed, a book he wrote with Jennifer Schneider, an old friend who wrote the book Living Recovery. Dr. Rob's Psychology Today blog is called Love and Sex in the Digital Age. He also has a great podcast called Sex, Love, and Addiction. Sexual addiction is a big, wide umbrella, and we could go in a number of directions. But in this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, we're going to maintain our focus on porn addiction in the digital age, which Dr. Weiss will be discussing in greater detail at the upcoming 48th annual conference of the Texas Association of Addiction Professionals. Details are at tapstateconference.org. I will once again be emceeing the conference and will be broadcasting Recovery Coast to Coast from there again this year. Dr. Weiss, a pleasure to speak with you, and I really, really look forward to meeting you down in San Antonio.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. I'm thinking of all the years that I used to talk about porn in a completely different way, and now we're here talking from a recovery perspective, which I love.
In this program, we'll definitely talk about treatment and recovery. What does that look like for a porn addict? We'll find out. How is it similar to or different from so-called traditional addiction recovery? But let's begin by asking the question, how and why do people become addicted to pornography? And what are some of the signs and symptoms?
Well, I don't think that there are any real differences in why someone becomes addicted to pornography versus alcohol, drugs. We all have injuries. We all have issues. I think every addict knows that they have stuff going on from the past that's driving addiction. But we have to deal with the addiction, right? That's the most important part, or we can't look at any of that. So I work with men primarily, and I've been working with them in sex addiction and porn addiction for 30 years, as I can't believe all that time has gone by. But the most universal thing for all of the men I work with is really a lot of early neglect, different kinds of abuse. They really learn not to trust anyone but themselves. And that includes, in the porn addicts, people. Unlike your traditional sex addict, if you will, the porn addicts are not out there having sex with strangers or having affairs. They're in their room with the door closed, looking at a flickering screen. And I think one thing I can say about them is that there's greater shame for them. I mean, as shameful as it is for these guys who are running around having sex with strangers and lying to their spouses, there's a unique shame for a man in particular who's 23 years old and has never had sex and sits in his bedroom by himself looking at porn. So it's a much more shameful issue on that level. And it's interesting. You asked the question, how do you identify it? It's a tough one. Most of my clients are wife referred. They're coming to me because their spouse said, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. But it's really a disorder of intimacy. It's a disorder of disconnection. All addictions are about isolation, but this is particularly isolating. And it's not like they're going to a bar or doing drugs with a lot of friends and then going off on their own. This is something people do completely by themselves, and as best they try it, no one knows anything about it.
We are only as sick as our secrets. Is porn addiction an actual addiction, or in fact a subset of sex addiction?
Well, we've only recently had a diagnosis for sex addiction, because for so long it was does this really exist, and is this really a thing, and this is people being conservative, and they're anti-this and not for that. And I think those folks really didn't understand what we've been dealing with in all these years. I've always had porn addicts. When I was back in the day, now I can say that as an older person, back in the day, people used to come to me and they'd say, I have a garage full of porn, or I have boxes full of porn, or I keep buying, when it was magazines and videos. I used to buy it and then I'd feel bad about it and I'd throw it all in the trash and then I would buy more. I had the guys, if you remember the old phone sex days where you charged $3.99 a minute to talk to someone, and they would run up $5,000 and $10,000 phone sex bills. Being addicted to porn has always been there. It's just, the accessibility and the affordability that online experience gives. Now I don't have to worry about who's seeing me. I don't have to walk into that little porn shop and worry about parking out in the back. I have the ability to access it anytime, 24/7. So obviously it's a completely different world, and it's so much easier for people to get caught up in the addictive behavior because there are so many fewer obstacles to getting to it.
There's a lot of triggers around, obviously, porn addiction. It's everywhere. Traditional advertising can be explicit. Then there's demeaning, ugly videos and images and narratives, and mostly online. Now, if the computer is a trigger for a porn addict, how can that person navigate online help or treatment?
Well, I would ask you, if alcohol is a trigger for people, how can they live in a world where people drink wine and go to bars, or have drinks at a party that they go to? I mean, as an addict, I don't care what your addiction is. You have to find your limits. You have to understand your boundaries. You have to understand what triggers you. You have to understand what to do when that happens. So we do simple things like bookending, and you know what this is. I
Mm-hmm.
call you, I call my sponsor or my therapist, whatever, before I get online, period. And then I tell them when I'm going to be off, and I get off. And so I have had a bookended experience where on some level I know that somebody's expecting me to call, expecting me to, accountability is always key, as you know, to recovery. Because I would say to the guys, you can have sex with anyone you want, you can do whatever you want, you just have to call me first. And if you can get me to agree that it's an okay thing for you to do, go right ahead. And that accountability, that structure, simply having to reach out to someone and make that connection, as you know, in any addiction, although in particular one of isolation, that is the key. It sounds simplistic, but working a program in this particular disorder is essential. And as you and I both believe that it's wonderful if people can look back their past and they can afford therapy and they have time to examine what happened to them. And, I'm a master at that. I love doing that psychotherapy work. But the bottom line is you got to get sober and you got to stop your behavior and you have to find a way to live in the real world with a computer and not act out. There are triggers for sex everywhere. It doesn't mean that sex addicts have to act out. There are triggers for, as I said, alcohol everywhere, but it doesn't mean that I have to drink. So I think it's really about focusing on recovery and understanding what that means.
One of the stereotypes of porn addiction is that it is exclusive to men. What about porn addiction for women?
I run a women's program. I think I created at the time the only women's program for compulsive sexual behavior.
Wow.
And women get pulled into it for all kinds of reasons. I mean, you have to understand that men are visually stimulated in a way that women aren't. We like to look, in case that's no surprise, and we like visual images and we like visual stimulation. So for us, of course, porn, for example, is a big deal because it's constantly changing images. And it is re-stimulation, new images all the time, which, by the way, is part of what affects relationships and intimacy because, no partner is exciting every time. I've seen that before. It's not like it's all new to me if I've been together with someone. So I think that's some of the obstacles that it offers. Men come for the visual stimulation, which is what we like. Men come for the novelty of the different imagery, which we like. That's how men are built. But the women that I see most often have pretty profound sexual abuse in their histories. And it's interesting, they get brought in for different reasons than the men do. Boys, for the most part. I think girls who have damage emotionally and sexually, they may just find it, look for it, whatever that is. But I run into a lot of women who end up with porn addiction because they have the underlying issues that would drive it. But they end up there for different reasons. They're there because they want to see, what do my boobs look like compared to other women? What kind of sex are other women having? My spouse brought me in and had me look at some porn. So women get introduced to it in a way that I don't think they're mostly seeking it out in the same way that men are. But let's face it, male porn and female porn is not that different. Male porn is, let's get to it, let's see it, let's watch it happen, and I'm done. For women, it's all of that, but they also need to see some emotional context. You can watch the same porn with a man and a woman, but as long as there's some piece of, do you care about me? Do we know each other? I like you. You just have a little piece of that, and all of a sudden it's porn for women. And so as the porn folks have gotten more knowledgeable, they are changing the face of porn for women so that it has more relationship-oriented stuff. So you are getting elements of like Twilight or, those things that show the intensity of some romantic sexual drama that they get into, and then, of course, what they're really into is porn on a regular basis. I wanted to say something too about porn, just to say it, which is a lot of folks think, oh, this is a bunch of young guys. They're 20, they're 25, they got it, they're 30, they got introduced to porn when they were kids, or, internet has been around their whole lives. And that's who I thought we'd be seeking therapy when doing treatment, was for that issue, for the porn issue, was younger men. It is fascinating to me that I have men coming in who are 50, who are 60, who are 45, and they say, I've been abusing porn my entire life, since I was 9. And there never was an internet when they came along. And I just sort of didn't think, dealing with sex addiction for so long as the issue, I didn't understand, nor did we really see these men coming in for porn problems. But I think wives and spouses are much more aware of how porn is pulling away the intimacy, destroying their sex lives, leading a life of secrecy. And, they're much more able to say, I don't like this porn, in a way that they might not have said 15 or 20 years ago. And by the way, when you have kids at home and there's porn on the computer, and the kids come home, mom does not like it. So in any case, I just think it's interesting that we're seeing lots of men who are older dealing with this, and it's not just a whole bunch of young people, which surprised me.
You know, it kind of reminds me of a classic poster that I had in my office down in Santa Barbara years ago when I ran the NCA office, National Council on Alcoholism. It was called The Typical American Alcoholic, and there were 12 photos of men and women, all ages, all ethnicities, all social
Uh-huh.
status, and the tagline was Alcoholism is an equal opportunity disease. Same thing here.
It's a sad truth, and it's funny you say that because it's not funny, but I have men who come into treatment. And by the way, as I said, I've treated women, but right now I run a men's program. And I don't believe in gender mixed treatment, by the way. I just think it's an obstacle that doesn't need to be there when you're doing
Absolutely.
treatment.
Glad you said that.
It's true for gay men too, or lesbian women, but it's in a different way.
Hmm.
But you've got a whole bunch of boys and girls, men and women in a treatment center, and boy, they're going to act differently. They're going to dress differently. They're going to talk differently. And let's face it, the sexual issues that I have to talk about with them, especially with the women, which is stuff like rape and abortion and molestation, they're never going to talk about that in front of a bunch of men. So
Mm.
yes, gender separate treatment is really important. But I wanted to say something about your comment, which is, at the treatment center right now, I have a man who is a neurosurgeon, and I've got a guy sitting next to him who is a priest. And then next to him, I've got a guy who, basically does street cleaning. And it doesn't matter. I look at these men like you do in meetings, and what they have in common is the alienation, the isolation, the shame about the sexual behavior, the people they're harming, the loss of connection and family. That's how addicts come together. It's one of the few things I see people really join together around the problem. And when you get to the problem, like you and I know, nothing else matters. There are no barriers between where you come from. There's no class. There's no race. There is, we want to heal, and we will heal together. And so I see that all the time, and it always fascinates me that men of such diverse backgrounds come together and they say, you're just like me.
You know, there's a stigma about all addiction, but gosh, with porn addiction, it seems like it would be stigma on steroids. My goodness.
Well, I actually think sex addiction has more stigma because
Yeah.
going out there and seeing 35 sex workers, I want to be kind, that's appropriate. Seeing 35 sex workers or massage therapists in a year, that feels much more, excuse the word, sleazy or perverted or much more of a violation. What about STDs? And in these days, what about COVID and monkeypox, all that stuff. But if you have someone sitting in their home just doing this by themselves, you more think, oh, poor guy. This is really sad. He leaves work and he doesn't go out with friends and he doesn't go out to have a date or whatever. He sits alone in his room for 5 hours. And so I think it has a different kind of stigma, as I said. But look, the World Health Organization said in 2018, we need a diagnosis for compulsive sexual behavior, and we have one in every country but the United States. And in 2023, I think we're going to have one in the United States. They're not going to call it porn addiction or sex addiction. Note that our diagnoses, excuse me for getting formal here, we don't use alcoholism or drug addiction. They have these fancy things called substance abuse disorder or substance use disorder. But when you look at what's in parentheses, it's alcohol and drug addiction. So in the same way, we are getting a diagnosis for compulsive sexual behavior, but no one's going to call it sex addiction. That's going to be in parentheses. But you and I go to a meeting, it's sex addiction.
Yeah. You're chief clinical officer at Seeking Integrity down in Southern California. What treatment options do you offer?
I've been privileged to open and run many treatment centers in my 30 years in doing this work. And I've done it in high-end treatment centers. I've done it for the military. I've created programs overseas. And if you said, I've written a ton of books. So at this age, my goal was to open a small treatment center that was not very expensive because, some of those places are beyond the reach of most people, where there would be excellence. And I think you and I both know that any treatment center is only as good as the people who are working there.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how great the name of the place is. You think, oh, I want to send them to this place. Well, if there's only interns who've been doing the work for a year and a half who's actually working with the client, you're not going to have the same level of experience as someone who's had 30 years. So we are doing intensive treatment for men who have sex addiction problems, porn addiction problems, and some of them have co-occurring drug issues. So I've got these men who are abusing coke or abusing alcohol or abusing meth, and they can't get out of their drug and alcohol problem unless they deal with the sex. So really, treatment at Seeking Integrity is about a lot of things. I mean, certainly it's traditional addiction treatment, but it's also about getting under the issues. What is driving them? And People don't talk about sex in treatment centers. I teach this when I go out and teach. Therapists are trained. When we are trained, we're trained about everything. Everything. And when we do an interview with you, we ask about eating, we ask about exercise, we ask about your history, we ask about family, we ask about school, we ask about all of it. But we never say, have you ever had an affair? How often do you masturbate? How do you feel about those questions? Don't come up in treatment. They don't come up in our training. I have so many clients who have been to 2 or 3 drug addiction programs. They never could get sober. And what's the reason? Because they're hiding things about their sexuality that they don't want to talk about, either their own shame or things that have happened to them. And I've said to other treatment centers, look, just have one group a week for men and sex or for women and sex so they can talk about this stuff. It's okay to have the stigma of sexuality in our culture, but to bring it into treatment means denying people the opportunity to talk about some of the most basic things that we experience as human beings. And I have many, many clients who will say, I started drinking at 17, but I started acting out sexually when I was 11, but I've never talked about it. So one of the things I'm particularly invested in the drug addiction world is those people who can't get sober because of underlying issues related to sex that they've never dealt with or thought they'd gotten over. And then I'm treating, your average run-of-the-mill sex addict who's ruining their lives or ruining their careers. And by the way, just like drugs and alcohol, that's why people come in. They come in because their spouse says, I'm taking the kids and I'm taking the family and I am done with this. They come in because their boss found porn on the computer. They come in because their kids saw something. I mean, everyone, as you know, comes in a crisis. Only my folks come in really in relationship crises for the most part because of what they're doing.
You're in a residential setting. What is the length of stay? How big is the facility? And what about a family program?
Yeah. Well, I'm only interested. Honestly, I think treatment is too big. I think what treatment is about is bringing small groups of people together to learn how to grow intimate relationships, but not sexual relationships. So we treat 8 or 9 people at a time. That's it. And my goal in part is to get these men to build meaningful, supportive, loving relationships that have nothing to do with sex, that are based on their healing. Basically, it's about taking a bath in making use of other people for support. Because, addicts, they're going to go off by themselves and do their own thing, and they're going to isolate, keep secrets. We create a healthy family, so I think the social learning piece is really important. So I put my guys in a really nice house with a chef, and I don't get to have a chef. I'm jealous of them. But it's not because I want them to have some fancy experiences, because I don't want them complaining about that. I want them focused on recovery. So we will do anything from 14 days, which I think is helpful for a lot of folks who are just beginning to understand this, all the way to 30 days for people whose relationships are in serious crisis, or the people who are doing drug addiction and sex addiction, they stay longer. People are professionals like doctors who are in trouble with their licenses, and they will stay longer. But we will start at 2 to 3 weeks and go all the way to 4. It really just depends on what that client needs. Families get a phone call when you're in an alcohol and drug treatment. Most of them, we're going to talk to you about the issues next week. Tell me what's going on. A week later, let me tell you their discharge plan. And it doesn't work that way when I have a family in crisis. So spouses are intimately involved. Let me just say this. I mean, not only are we doing family sessions and couple sessions, a lot of that stuff, but if you read any of my work, I don't think partners and loved ones of addicts are addicted. I don't think, unless they may have their own addictions, but I'm not addicted to my husband's sex addiction. I'm not addicted to my husband. What spouses need is support. They need nurturing. They need to get off of that eggshell that they've been walking on and find some peace. That's very different than what an addict needs. So when I work with spouses, it's a lot about nurturing, support, compassion, encouraging the good love that they give and taking care of themselves with boundaries. But I'm not challenging them about denial and how they're doing it the wrong way and they're destroying their lives. And so there is a balance. I would not bring a couple into residential treatment, for example, because the spouses don't need anything like what the addicts need. What the spouses are really looking for is to understand, is my relationship going to heal? How will it heal? Where have we been? Where are we going to go forward? I'll just say this, I work with tons and tons of spouses, and it's fascinating to me, Neil, because we read letters that the spouses send us. We ask the spouses we ask them, what has your life been like with this person? What have your concerns been about your husband? And what have you felt, has been the biggest issues, all of that? And, they're there for sex addiction. They're there for porn addiction. But when I read those spouses' letters, 90% of it is, I just wish you were honest with me. I just wish I knew who you were. I just wish we had a connection. I just wish I knew the truth. It's interesting to me that spouses are not necessarily looking for, why did you have sex with other people and how could you do this to me? And they know that. The part that they're deeply concerned about is, we've been together 20 years and I don't know who you are. And if we're going to have a relationship, you need to open up to me and be honest with me. I often hear from spouses, I don't care that you have a porn addiction. What I care about is that you could have told me 20 years ago and I could have helped you with this. But instead, you kept it a secret for 20 years and you ruined our lives. So what we hide and isolate with often, I think, is it won't make our spouses happy. But if they see us in pain, they see us in the early stages, they're going to want to support us. When they find out 20 years later or 15 years later that we've been doing things that we never told about them about since we were 15, they're not so happy.
Is treatment covered by insurance?
No.
Oh.
And there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, we don't have a diagnosis for sex addiction in the United States. And actually, to be honest, insurance doesn't pay for any kind of sexual issues. And number two, I don't believe in insurance in America. I've worked at treatment centers. I was in the corporate world with those high-end places. And I can tell you, and you know this, that I'm going to call and I'm going to say I need treatment. And they're going to say, well, we think your insurance is really going to pay for this. Why don't you come on in? And then I come in and 10 days in, they say, oh, we're really sorry, your insurance isn't going to pay anymore. What am I supposed to do? Am I going to walk out on treatment after 10 days? Or am I going to walk out with a $60,000 bill? So one of the things that I really appreciate about doing lower cost non-insurance payment, we won't take insurance, is because I don't trust the insurance company. And because I want people to know when they walk in the door exactly what they're going to pay, exactly what they're going to walk out of there with, and not have to guess, well, if my insurance company gives me 3 more days. And that's how it works, in treatment. The insurance company calls and they say, we'll give you till Tuesday. And then you have to call us back. And then we go through all the problems. And then they say, okay, we'll give you till Saturday. And that's just not how treatment is done. So no, we don't take insurance.
What about online therapy? Is that an option? I know that you have a lot of courses and stuff on your website that seem very intriguing.
Well, one of the issues that came up during COVID, I've been saying to therapists for years because I've been very tech focused. I say therapists, when I teach them, don't take any long leases. Because I always knew we would get to this day where, people wouldn't want to. I mean, look, what was therapy? It's working all day long, getting out of work. My spouse and I spend a half an hour getting to see you as a therapist. We're tired, we're exhausted, late in the evening. We see you, we work on difficult issues, and then we have to go home and take care of our family. And that's not how the world is anymore. You don't see people at the mall for 3 hours after work. They get online. And what is really satisfying to people these days, I really believe it, not to the therapist necessarily, but the clients, which is they can sit down at the end of the evening when they're done with their work and they don't have to drive somewhere else and do therapy. And I think in many, many cases that is really fine. Now, therapists cannot do, just to say it, I can't do therapy across state lines. So if I'm in California and you're in New York, it doesn't matter how much expertise I have. I can't do formal therapy with you in another state. That's the state of the world at the moment. I think that will change. But what I can do is educate. So we have courses, Sex Addiction 101, Porn Addiction 101, healing your, when you've cheated on a partner, how to heal that. If you're a betrayed partner, how do you understand what you've been through and grow? So what I can offer, and by the way, you don't get this in therapy, because when I sit with you for an hour, I can't do a lecture and give you homework. I got to do therapy with you. So we're filling in the spaces with the things that actually happen in residential treatment, which is all the educational part. And for not a lot of money, you can sit down and take a 6-week course or an 8-week course and really and homework and all that, and really understand what it's about and what you need to do to heal. And by the way, Neil, I want to say really strongly, because this is my belief. I started as a social worker, as a social worker in my heart. So many people are never going to get to therapy. Far more people are going to struggle on their own than are ever going to get to therapy. They can't afford it. They don't have time. They don't have an interest. They're scared of it. But they can go online and learn. They can go online and educate themselves. We have a whole site. I think we have 19 free groups. One of my goals as an older person in recovery was I wanted to give things away. And so I have therapists who are doing groups for spouses, groups for addicts, group for, as much as we charge for residential treatment or we charge for the courses, there's a whole world of support that we give away for free. And videos are free, and podcasts are free, and blogs are free, and all the support groups are free. And it's as important to me, I like to be paid, I like to be able to pay my mortgage. But I also want to, at this age in recovery, like you, I want to give it away.
Yeah.
I want to take everything I've learned and give it away. And if you stop at our website, you will see support groups for spouses, support groups for addicts, support groups for single addicts, support groups for gay, all of it. Because people aren't necessarily ever going to go to 12-step meetings. But they can come and they can learn and they can be a part of a group, and it's all anonymous, and we're not selling them anything. And, this is my belief system, is to give away as much as you charge for.
You mentioned support groups and 12-step meetings. Is there a Porn Addicts Anonymous?
There is.
Wow.
PAA. And you can go online and look up Porn Addicts Anonymous. And as I said, they don't really feel like they fit in the sex addicts meeting because they haven't been out there having all this kind of sex. And so they're looking for people who isolate and don't go out in the world for sex like they do. And they formed their own program. And I have to say it's doing well and as it should be. And probably at some point it'll be busier than the sex addiction work because, as we talked about, the online world is taking over. By the way, Neil, I love this. When you or I were younger, I keep talking about age, but we're close to each other.
I know it.
Do you remember that the issue was overpopulation?
Yeah.
That the world was going to have too many people. I think China had a one-child policy, right? They were so afraid of over. Well, now we have underpopulation. Now we don't have enough younger people having children. And I think the compulsive porn piece has something to do with it. We have studies where in different countries where men have said, quite a number of them in a study, I know you can go out and have sex with a person, but that's difficult. And you have to take them out. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't. Maybe they'll have sex with you, maybe they won't. I'd just rather sit home and look at my porn and play my games with friends. And so I actually think we're seeing a cultural shift away from intimacy and connection in real life, which is fine if you want to connect online, but just don't have babies that way.
What does recovery from porn addiction look like in the real world and in the digital world? It's embarrassing to be a recovering porn addict. How can you embrace and how can you enhance your recovery?
First of all, when you're dealing with behavior addictions like food or sex, porn is a part of sex, right? We don't tell people, if you're in AA, you don't ever have to drink again. You don't ever have to do drugs again. You can have a perfectly good life without drinking or using. You can have a perfectly good life without ever going in another casino. It's simpler in some ways, and it's simple, not easy. It's simpler to define recovery and sobriety when you're dealing with such concrete things. But when you're dealing with sex or food, for that matter, I don't want people to stop having sex. I don't want them to stop eating. But I want them to do these things in a way that leads them to health and not to dis-ease and problems. So we will literally put a boundary around what kinds of, with the sex addicts, what kind of sex is healthy, what kind of sex isn't healthy. That bottom line, I don't see sex workers, I don't call exes, I don't go online and do this or that. That is their sobriety. So with porn addicts, it really is, I'll tell you what, it's imagery you wouldn't want a healthy 6-year-old to see. How about that? That's porn.
Good definition.
And I can define it. It's not that hard. When I talk about sex addiction, a lot of people don't know what sex is, believe it or not. In many ways, they call things sex that aren't sex. They call things that are sex aren't. So my definition for a sex addict is anything that you can do in a park, in public, when there's a 4-year-old looking up. So you can kiss, you can hug, you can hold hands, but you ain't going to do more than that because you're in a public place and a 4-year-old's watching. I say the same thing to porn addicts. If a child or a vulnerable person were looking at this, is it something they should be looking at? And it's very easy for them to quickly determine what is okay and what isn't. And then we have to write that up as a sobriety plan and put it in place. And as long as they don't cross those lines, they're not breaking their sobriety. But I'll tell you where the challenge is that I have men who will say, okay, I'm not looking at porn. I'm just looking at Instagram. I'm just looking at images on TikTok or Facebook. And they say, since it's not a porn platform, it's not really porn. Well, you should ask their spouses what they think. I'm looking at someone in half of a bathing suit, walking, bending over at the beach, but that's not porn because it's on Instagram. Well, it is porn for them. And so it's not just about drawing boundaries about what we would think is traditional porn. It's also about avoiding the triggers that someone can lose themselves in that are porn enough. And I know as a sex addict and working with sex addicts, we can sexualize a rock. I can have an 85-year-old woman come into treatment and do an amazing job, and they're sexualizing her because she's there and she's a woman, because that's what sex addicts do. We sexualize. And so I have to be really careful with porn addicts about not only the specific porn imagery they're looking at, but all the imagery they're looking at, because a trigger is a trigger, and before you know it, you're back in that behavior that you said you weren't going to be in, but there you are.
Before we end this, and I know our time is limited, I do want to pivot to a book that you wrote, and I believe it's going to be the topic of the conference down in Texas, Pro-Dependence, the End of Codependency. That, to me, is fascinating. Give us kind of a thumbnail of what you're going to be talking about, and more importantly, what is pro-dependence?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to mention that, and I am doing a large keynote. I think we're going to have like 800 people for this talk.
It's a huge conference.
And how long has it been since I've worn a tie? But in any case, I have grown up with alcoholics and mentally ill people, and I went through the whole codependency period in the 90s and 80s where people said you have to detach, you have to move away, you have to let them struggle for themselves. And not only that, but you have to look at what's wrong with you as a family member, as a spouse. Why did you marry this person? Why did you get involved with this person? Or if you're a parent, why do they have these problems? And what is your part in it? And I have always felt like it was never my fault. In fact, I'll say this to every spouse that's listening, and every partner, and every family member. There is nothing you can do on God's earth that will make somebody use or act out. I cannot make someone drink. I can make their life miserable. I can gain 400 pounds. I can, whatever it is, and they can go for a walk. They can find another family, but the decision to drink, the decision to sexual out is acting out is mine. So the whole idea that there's something wrong with my partner or family member that drives me to drink, that leaves me, that's something addicts like to think about because it gives them an excuse to keep using. Why do we stigmatize and challenge and question the emotional health of people who have stuck by us, through our falling on the ground and getting arrested and being out there getting STDs and all the stuff that addicts do? Why would we ever challenge the people who stand by us? And so I decided, I did my PhD dissertation on codependency. It has never been a diagnosis. It's never had research that backs it up. At best, codependency, all it's ever been is a pop culture idea. There's no reason, it's not a diagnosis. We can't bill for it. So what is codependency? It's an idea. And ideas are great and interesting, and we can talk about them over dinner, but I'm not going to treat someone for an idea. What I see when I see families and spouses of addicts is I see incredibly loving people who are in the middle of a crisis, who are doing the best they can to stick by and help that addict get sober. They will turn themselves inside out, gain weight, give up their jobs, do terrible self-care, sticking by an addict who's struggling. And then they get into treatment and someone says, thank goodness your husband, wife, girlfriend, sex treatment. Now let's talk about what's wrong with you. And that drives the family members crazy because what they feel like is they've done everything right. They've hung in there with this person. They've supported this person. And I guess I'll leave you with this. And this is what pro-dependence is all about. It's about celebrating and validating family members and those who love an addict. And instead of looking at them and saying, what are the reasons you stay with this person? And what is your history? And what about trauma? I don't care about all that. What I care about is they have lived through a crisis. They've stuck by this person. What I will say to a family member or someone who's deeply loving an addict is how brave you were, how courageous you were to stand by and love this person despite all the challenges that they've thrown at you. You're amazing. You're a saint. And the last thing I'll say about codependence is simply this. If I had a medically ill person that I loved, they had cancer, and they were lying in bed and we didn't know if they were going to get better or not, I would give up my job, work 3 jobs, take care of everything, manage everything, read every book. I would become a detective about cancer. I would give my whole life up to understanding cancer because I don't want my family member to die, and I want to take care of them. And by the way, if my partner or family member has cancer, people are going to bring me casseroles, and they're going to bring me gifts, and they're going to spend the night till I can go out, and they're going to call me an angel for sitting by this very deeply sick person who I love and giving up my life for them for a period of time. But if the person I love is an addict and they're sitting up in bed because they're using and they hate themselves and they're miserable and they can't get sober, and I stick by them and I help them and I give up parts of my life to support them, then I'm told there's something wrong with me.
Amazing.
How can it be if I stick by someone that I love when they're medically ill that I'm an angel, and if I stick by them when they're an addict, there's something wrong with me? And that's what codependence is about. It's about not saying anything to family members or loved ones except how amazing that you hung in there with this troubled person. And by the way, you didn't do everything right. Maybe some of what you did would be called enabling or enmeshing or whatever that is. But who cares? You did the best you could, the best you knew how to do. And I'm going to celebrate you for that, which codependency doesn't do, but pro-dependency certainly does.
I love it. And I'm interested in hearing a lot more about pro-dependence in person down in Texas, and perhaps after your keynote presentation, you can stop by the broadcast location, and maybe we can do another segment specifically on pro-dependence. I think it's a paradigm shift from what people are used to hearing about, and I think it's important to get that message out.
You going to come to my talk, Neil?
Absolutely, I definitely will be there.
And I'll follow you out the door. And we'll have a
okay, you got a deal,
folks. I just want to tell all of you. You are so fortunate to have this man doing this, and I hope he doesn't cut this out. Where he's been in his life, the work that he's done in recovery, the length of time he's spent volunteering, and honestly, I think that is a great sign of recovery, is what are you willing to give? And this man who is doing this recording has given his whole life, and I just really hope that you appreciate that he's continuing to give and give back to each one of you. And you have to leave that on the recording, okay?
Okay. Thank you,
right.
Dr. Rob.
See you in Texas.
All right. See you at the beautiful Hyatt Regency Country Resort in San Antonio. Find out the details, tapstateconference.org. If you're anywhere near there, you need to get to this conference. And again, I'll be emceeing it, and I'll have a broadcast location. Please stop by. And Dr. Rob has agreed to sit down and talk more about pro-dependence. I look forward to meeting you in person, my friend.
And by the way, if folks want to find me, they want to write me a note. I answer stuff. I point them in the right direction. I am Rob at seekingintegrity.com. They can write. There's no question too small. I will answer it.
And check out seekingintegrity.com. There is a boatload of resources there. Thanks so much for your time.
Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Neil.
Again, our thanks to Dr. Rob Weiss, Chief Clinical Officer at Seeking Integrity. You can find out more about Dr. Rob as well as discover tons of excellent information and resources, including a complete listing of 12-step support programs. Their site is seekingintegrity.com. By the way, I want to remind listeners of this podcast that if you'd like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, as long as you've been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. In just 30 seconds, we're going to hear from legendary actor Dick Van Dyke about people, places, and things. Please stay with us.
She has always been your baby, but when your daughter got into drugs and alcohol, she turned into a stranger. What do you do? Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown's nationally recognized youth treatment program guides young people back to a life free of drugs and alcohol. All treatment is gender-specific and directed by caring certified professionals in a safe environment. You can get your daughter back and get to know her again. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, a thought for the day from an iconic actor who is in long-term recovery. He is award-winning actor Dick Van Dyke. He's talking about people, places, and things.
Do not depend on one thing or trust to only one resource, however preeminent. Baltasar Gracian. When we think of dependency, what usually comes to mind are addictive substances, such as alcohol and cocaine, or addictive behavior patterns, such as compulsive overeating. But there are other, less obvious kinds of dependency that can be just as destructive. What about dependency on people, places, and things? Haven't we all met someone whose self-image and actual identity depend on a job title or a particular make of car? And certainly we know how easy it is to become dependent on a partner for emotional security. If we're inclined to be overly dependent on people or things, it's usually because we feel inadequate or unsure of ourselves. But unfortunately, when we go outside of ourselves for emotional security, what we end up with is only a false sense of security that often becomes a form of bondage. And if the relationship ends or we lose the job title or exotic car, we're left feeling helpless and empty. It's less likely that we'll fall into such dependency traps if we have a strong identity, and healthy self-image. But these qualities don't come automatically. We have to be willing to work for our personal security and confidence, rather than trying to get them the easy way from people, places, or things. Thought for today: dependency comes in many forms.
Well, that wraps up this edition of the National Podcast Recovery Coast to Coast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. And please hit the subscribe or follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. Let us know what you like and what you don't like as we try to make each podcast a little bit better than the previous one. And that also helps us to carry the message, especially on social media. And another reminder, September is National Recovery Month. You can find out what events are happening in your community by going to nationalrecoverymonth.org. They do this every September around the country, and this year's theme is Recovery is for everyone, every person, every family, every community. And remember, if you know someone who is experiencing the problems of alcohol or other drugs, here's a 24-hour free national helpline. It offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals available as well. 1-800-622-HELP, H-E-L-P. And be sure and join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the national podcast. And another quick shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, successfully treating individuals, including adolescents and their families, for well over 50 years. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to others. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.